Guess who got brands talking? Brandlive.co.za.
Welcome to the Financial Independence Coach, naturally creating freedom, meaning, and wealth. Brought to you by Yvonne Pty Ltd, in association with Brandlive.co.za. And here is your host and coach, Yvonne E. Ventilo.
Good morning, Brand Live streamers and Yvonne Pty Ltd subscribers. Yes, you are with the Financial Independence Coach again. I hope you all are full of life, alive, and blessed this morning. This morning we are talking meaning. Meaning, culture, relationships with self and others. And to go a bit deeper into this, from a small business perspective, I have the privilege to introduce you again to Ferdi Hartzenberg from Hardcorp. Good morning, Ferdi. How are you?
Good morning, Yvonne. Like always, it's a privilege to be with you this morning.
It's absolutely wonderful to have you here. Now, Ferdi, the reason why I invited you back is because I want us to go a bit deeper into human resources and industrial relationships for the small businesses. But today specifically, I want to focus on the intent of meaning of HR. Now, my understanding, and it's a very simple understanding of HR, is to initialize the relationship between the employer and the employee, and then to maintain and build it from there on. And heavens forbid, should it come to a point where the two's paths should separate, to separate as friends, or alternatively hand it over to IR to take further steps. Now, can you give us a bit more of an insight specifically, from a HR's perspective? What is that relationship building that you do between the employer and the employee?
Traditionally, human resources was always viewed as an add-on function in terms of any entity. However, that perception has been eradicated, and now human resources is viewed as a business partner to the corporation. And employers have realized that employees are the building block and the labor component that actually drives any organization. The difference between human resources and industrial relations in a layman's view is human resources would be the take-on body and therefore the development of staff. Industrial relations, again, would be the division or the entity that would deal with the management of employee relations, or would I rather say with employees in an entity, and ultimately by virtue of discipline, and if it is then necessary, ultimately then to look at determination of an employee. Industrial relations, albeit employee relations, will also deal with operational terminations, where an employer, on account of operational or an economical rationale, can no longer afford to sustain its operation and therefore need to retrench staff. So that would be, in a nutshell, the difference between human resources and industrial relations.
So let's focus on human resources, the intake, the build of the relationship, the build of the culture of the company. Now, for many SMEs and small businesses, they don't have an HR person necessarily. Sometimes they do outsource it, sometimes they just decide to do this themselves. But what is it that crux that the HR actually builds up? Why is it so important for a small business to have either somebody employed within their business to do HR or have it outsourced?
I would fall back again on your labor component. Now, a lot of SMEs sell service. Now, the pivotal person in that relationship is actually the employee, because that would be the person that would actually sell the product or sell the service rather. So if that person is either not competent for the capacity that he or she has been appointed for, or not developed properly for the role that they need to assume, that could cause havoc for that SME, because the employer would sit with someone that virtually cannot fulfill what they are employed for. So it's vital that an employer make sure that his labor component is fully competent for the work that they are actually employed for.
So it's like a scenario of the HR needs to describe the intent in full details and then make sure that that employee that is brought in fulfills or achieves that intent. Now, in a scenario where the employee was on paper the perfect candidate to achieve the intent of the position, but has now come to a point where they're not able to fulfill that intent, what would an HR person from their side do to, I would say, not mend, but sustain and maintain the relationship between the employer and the employee?
In life, we take on a lot of relationships, and not all of these relationships are always fruitful. So we need, in terms of human resources, we need to look at those relationships that are not performing as anticipated. So we need to ascertain what the anticipated standard would be, or the standard of performance, and look at the capacity or the performance of the individual versus the anticipated capacity. And an employer needs to then look at means of how that staff member could be encouraged to reach that anticipated standard. And ultimately, if the person is not in a position to reach that standard, obviously look at terminating that relationship by virtue of the correct procedure.
And now, obviously, all these procedures and measuring the standards, all of those have, I almost want to say, a set sort of document that needs to go along with it to prove that there's a paper trail that the correct procedures was followed.
It is exceptionally important to follow the correct procedure and have a procedure that is transparent and in place in any organization. If it is a one-man concern or even a bigger company, it's vital that these policies are in place. Employers a lot of the times want to follow the incorrect way of managing staff. Instead of having these policies in place, would have obviously negated the whole issue of putting the company at risk.
And putting the company at risk, obviously this is where the financial, I almost want to say, judgment comes onto the company if they did not follow those specific procedures. And that's where it really comes and bites them in their back pocket. One
would normally consider or think of the CCMA as only as a body that would deal with dismissals. However, in terms of labour legislation, there's a referral called unfair labour practice, which entitles an individual to refer a dispute, albeit to a bargaining council or to the CCMA, and for that body then to deal with it ostensible unfairness. So employers also need to be very careful to have these policies in place to ensure that in the event that they are challenged in terms of fairness, that they can produce a policy to stipulate and to outline that yes, the SME does have policies in place that deal with that specific issue.
And it's not just a policy that's kept in a paper copy that's kept in a filing cabinet somewhere in the manager's office. This needs to be communicated to all staff members.
Yvonne, that's also the challenges of an SME, because a lot of smaller businesses must focus on what they do and what they do well. And with all due respect, a lot of the times they are not au fait with human resources or industrial relations as well. So then they, being that issue being a challenge to them, they would rather just forget about it. And until that issue has become a mammoth of a problem. And then obviously the only way of correcting that issue would be by virtue of defending it, which is obviously quite costly. So it makes business sense most of the times to outsource the human resources function to an entity outside that is clued up with dealing with matters of HR and with issues of IR.
And who is actually specialized in this field and knows, the ins and outs of the documentation, the procedures, and what is needed and what is not needed.
Correct the best practices, the current trends, and ways and means to save money for that entity, because human resources also perceived as a costly function, and one needs to dispense of that fallacy and to show that human resources is in fact the most important unit within your business or your company.
So let's take the example to make it easier for everybody to understand. When an individual decides, okay, well, now he's an entrepreneur and he's going to start a startup. Now, with most of my coaches, I coach them to look at the various 7 spheres of life in general, to make sure that they've got all their bases covered. Now, one of the spheres is relationships, as you know yourself. Now, from a startup's point of view, where would a startup start their basic HR? Because now it's a startup, it's just the individual. How would he put these policies, these procedures, this accountability basics in place for himself, from where to move forward when he starts recruiting?
I would go as far as to say that when one is developing a business plan for your business, and if it is your intention to employ staff, albeit 1 or even 2 people, to include human resources and how you would deal with human resources, and by virtue of that, I would at least start with employment contracts for your staff, and have the basic policies in place. By the time that you appoint staff, that these documentation is ready and available, that's not a scurry of finding and drafting these documentation belatedly.
But more about that after the break.
Harnessing the power of talk radio. brandlive.co.za.
Catch all your daily CSI news and updates on The Social Show.
What is the impact of this industry on our own economic, social, environmental, and cultural fabric? And I think it's important that we start looking and diving deeper into the solutions and the opportunities that may help shape the future.
Monday to Friday at 9:30 a.m. Get your financials in order with Yvonne Fentilo.
Brand Live listeners, yes, it's Monday and you are listening to the Financial Independence Coach.
Mondays 10:30 to 11 a.m. Having problems or you need guidance with matters of the heart? Then let the Love and Relationship Show smooth your relationship.
A man said something sometime. He said people don't really care much about how much you know, except they can confirm how much you care about them.
Mondays at 1. Looking for the freshest radio bangers, sexy smashes, and the coolest conversations. Hashtag with passion pushes.
Too much, man. Like, I remember when I was still in high school, like, I was always contemplating what is getting like, when is my time coming? Especially when you see, like, adults.
Are you listening to me?
Harnessing the power of talk radio. brandlive.co.za.
Have you ever thought about the power of social media? Social media has the power to make your business grow. Grow! Yeah. Why don't you let us manage your social media? Because our business is to see your business grow. Visit us at www.bstownmedia.co.za.
Live from 27 boxes in the heart of Melville, this is brandlive.co.za.
And we're back. You're listening to the Financial Independence Coach, brought to you by brandlive.co.za and Yeffel Pty Ltd. Recorded live here at 27 boxes in Melville. Today I'm talking to Ferdi Hartzenberg from Hardcorp Human Capital Solutions, and we're talking at the moment before the break about a startup and the policies and procedures that they need to put in place for their business so that they don't have to run around and scurry when they eventually then start employing staff. Now, Ferdi, those policies and procedures, and obviously the employment contracts, which policies and procedures would you state that is of vital importance to have in place from the word go?
The most vital document that any entity needs to have in place would be an employment contract to kick off with. I would then reckon a disciplinary code, a leave policy, and then one can obviously extend that with a maternity and with the latest amendments to the labour legislation, a paternity policy, a non-smoking policy, a vehicle policy, and forth. One can continue with a list. It's quite endless. If you think
it sounds like a list as long as my arm.
Exactly, but dependable again in terms of the operation of the entity. If a business is not going to employ 20 people, I would not look at something like, rather give another example. If it is only male employees, I would not look obviously at a maternity policy, with all due respect. So that's just a simple example in terms of
yeah, but now in a male dominant or male only environment, you would not look at maternity, but you would look at the paternity.
Correct.
Which is now, I believe, is now been put in place that fathers also have the right to take time off.
It's vital that you have a policy in place, because employees are already contemplating how they could extort the legislation. So you don't want to arrive at a situation where staff are absent to say that they are using their paternity leave when their attendance is of critical value to the organisation at that point in time.
It sounds all very interesting, and I mean, if you don't, I would say, cover your backside, then people will try and take chances. And that is the main reason why it's so important to have all these policies and procedures in place, so that the intent of the business and the intent of the employee can meet on a similar ground.
Moving over a bit to industrial relations, it's also vital that a staff member is made aware of the type of offences that would constitute dismissal in an entity, by virtue of saying a staff member needs to know that if there are issues of intoxication, of theft or fraud, that kind of behaviour would result in the staff member being dismissed.
Well, for instance, if I look at the financial industry where I'm from, all companies adhere to obviously the financial legislation, where it was very clearly stipulated that if you were caught out in a matter of fraud or theft of a client's premiums or so forth, not just will you be dismissed, but they will also go for debarment with the Financial Services Board. Now, those extra stuff, and I suppose in specific industries, can also be attached to those policies that are given over to employees.
Any employer reserves the right to lay charges, criminal charges, against the staff member who has been considered engaging in any act of theft or fraud or anything alike.
Or any dishonesty, any
Correct.
criminal offence.
So, although a staff member may be dismissed internally, so to speak, in terms of his employment contract, nothing precludes an employer to lay criminal charges and then for criminal court to pursue those charges of theft or fraud.
Because another scenario what I also picked up was quite a few SMEs, when they took out their short-term insurance, had a look at the section of employee dishonesty, which is obviously short-term insurance cover to cover you for those scenarios where there is employee dishonesty, theft, fraud, criminal offences. But very few actually put it in place. And when I questioned them on it, they couldn't tell me, they couldn't tell me we've already got a set procedure in place. Now, in scenarios like that where it is not very clearly stipulated to the employees what that dishonesty in quotations constitutes of, what is the procedure for an SME then to follow? If they then feel this employee was dishonest, but they don't have that in black and white written down, this is it or not.
Certain offences obviously what one could infer the assumption that something like theft, it's a common principle that one would be aware that one may or thou shall not steal. The best way of dealing with instances like that, of which would constitute very serious misdemeanors, is to have a disciplinary inquiry and to charge that staff member with the offence of unauthorized possession or dispensing resources or alternatively fraud, and then give that staff member an opportunity to ventilate his or her version at the disciplinary inquiry, and based on the facts then make a decision in terms of a finding. And then should the offence be of a serious nature, and if one would reckon that the employment relationship in terms of the trust relationship that is normally entrenched in such a relationship is damaged, then one could arrive at a juncture where the decision could be taken of termination of employment.
Okay. And in a lot of these situations that do occur, there also might be scenarios where the staff member is actually innocent. So the HR is not just there to protect the employer, but the employee as well.
That is exactly why it is so vital, and that is one of the services that we do offer, and that is of chairing disciplinary inquiries as we are not in arm's length of the situation. We could be impartial.
You're completely independent from the whole story.
So we would chair that inquiry and obviously make a fair and a just decision in terms of the person is guilty or not, and if the person is then guilty, also look at the substantive fairness. Was there a rule? Was the rule equitably applied? And also look at mitigating reasons, and then based on that submissions, come to a decision and make a recommendation to the employer.
Okay. So all of these that we've now discussed is within the scope of the HR, of the industrial relationship specialist, and is vital cost-wise for a whether it's a startup or whether it's a big corporation. Now obviously big corporations have these I will almost say departments within their shelf company, but for small businesses this is very of vital importance due to the cost that it could cost afterwards?
A lot of entities would expand the operations, but they would not expand proportionally in terms of human resources, and that's an entity that would at times lack and fall behind. And then suddenly a crisis would arrive, and nothing is in place in order to deal with it. And that's not necessarily always just policies and procedures. Perhaps it lacks also the way and the manner that the entity would have to deal with a certain staff member. And it makes sense to outsource that and get the necessary specialist in to say, let's deal with the situation on behalf of the employer, so that it's done in a cost-efficient manner as well. Ultimately, it's all about money, and the employer is also not at a position where they can just apply resources and that resources rather needs to serve to the betterment of that entity,
Of the cultural relationship within the entity as a whole, not just for the employer but for the employee as well.
Yes, correct.
Now, Fanny, in our discussions we have spoken about quite a few examples of small businesses that did not have these kind of procedures and policies and documents in place. Now, from your point of view as a specialist in the industry, how much more does it cost an employer, a small business, a startup, to not have this in place compared to taking that commitment, taking, I almost want to say, that leap of faith, and taking that capital and investing in putting these policies and procedures in place?
The problem that one sits with is that if you do not follow the correct procedures, and that could be linked to any situation in life, normally it becomes a very costly exercise. Likewise with human resources, if the correct procedures are not adhered to, you arrive at a juncture where it is difficult to cap the anticipated expenses. Whereas if you had a planned exercise, it's much easier to say, but we have these issues and procedures in place, and obviously it would be much cost efficient to the entity as well.
So in the long run, it's much more cost efficient for the small business, the startup, the entrepreneur, to sit down, include this in their startup capital, their startup calculations, make sure this is ticked off the to-do list, and it is done.
I would go as far to say not necessarily in terms of your budget, but included in terms of your business plan, because that's obviously your blueprint that any organization would work from.
Perfect. Now, Fanny, as per arranged, you are going to come and visit us at least once a month to go a bit deeper in this meaning, this culture that is between employers and employees. And obviously for all our listeners, give them a bit more interesting facts on this. But if anybody wants to get hold of you, where can they reach you?
They're more than welcome to make contact with me on my cell phone, 082 771 4655, 082 771 4655, or on email at ferdi@hartcorp.co.za.
Brilliant. Ferdi, it was absolutely lovely having you here, and we'll see you in 4 weeks' time here in studio again. But for all our listeners, our Brand Life streamers and our YEFL subscribers, I will see you on the flip side of this week. So have yourself a fabulous week and stay blessed.